Randolph Scott did not publicly name gay actors from old Hollywood. However, his own life and relationships have been the subject of speculation and discussion regarding the hidden lives of LGBTQ+ individuals during that era. Scott's close relationship with fellow actor Cary Grant is particularly notable. The two men met on the set of Hot Saturday in 1932 and subsequently lived together on and off for over a decade in a shared home nicknamed Bachelor Hall. Their cohabitation and the nature of their relationship have been the subject of much speculation, with some contemporaries and later biographers suggesting a romantic involvement. During the golden age of Hollywood, many actors who were gay or bisexual had to conceal their sexual orientation due to the industry's strict moral codes and the potential for career-ending scandal. Public acknowledgement of such identities was virtually non-existent, and studios often orchestrated relationships or marriages to maintain public images. While Scott himself did not disclose information about other actors' private lives, his own experiences reflect the broader context of secrecy and the pressures faced by LGBTQ+ individuals in Hollywood at the time. In summary, while Randolph Scott did not name gay actors from old Hollywood, his life and relationships offer insight into the concealed experiences of LGBTQ+ individuals in the film industry during that period. Imagine a world where you're celebrated by millions, adored on every movie screen, and yet every night you return home to silence. Not the peace of solitude, but the weight of secrecy. In the golden age of Hollywood, under the bright lights and behind the scenes, there existed a silent war. A war between the life the world demanded and the truth that lived inside. This is the story of Randolph Scott, a man who lived on horseback, carried justice in his eyes, and yet carried something else too. A secret. One that he shared with many but could never speak aloud. He wasn't alone in this burden. There was a quiet brotherhood in old Hollywood, a circle of men who smiled for the cameras while hiding the deepest parts of themselves. Men who played tough guys, romantic leads, fearless heroes, but who were never allowed to love openly. The stakes were too high. Careers could be ended in a whisper, a single rumor, and the studio would make you disappear. For someone like Randolph Scott, the cost of honesty was everything. And so, like so many others, he played the role, not just on screen, but in life. But what if the cowboy wasn't just acting brave? What if his quiet strength, his stoic gaze, came from living a truth that could never be shown? That's what makes this story so haunting. It's not just about one man. It's about a time, a system, a generation forced to choose between fame and freedom. And while he never openly confessed, those closest to him knew. They saw it in his friendships, his loyalty, the gentle sorrow behind his smile, especially in one relationship that raised more questions than answers, a friendship that lasted decades and defied the Hollywood script. Today, we don't tell this story to out or to scandalize. We tell it to honor, to remember the men who paved the road for others by walking it in silence. Randolph Scott's story is a symbol of old Hollywood's hidden heart, a heart that beat quietly but powerfully beneath the surface. In a time when love was a risk, he lived carefully, but never without courage. And tonight, we shine a light on the names that time tried to erase, beginning with the man who said nothing, but whose silence said everything. Before the whispers and the secrets, there was the spotlight. Randolph Scott didn't just walk into Hollywood, he rode in with a calm confidence that made him unforgettable. Born in Virginia and raised in North Carolina, Scott had the all-American look that casting directors dreamed of. Tall, square-jawed, and steady. He wasn't flashy or loud. Instead, he brought something rare: dignity, restraint, and a quiet strength that audiences trusted. When he spoke, it mattered. When he paused, you listened. and when he rode into a scene, he commanded it without even trying. He began humbly with minor roles and background appearances during the early 1930s. But even then, there was something magnetic about him. He soon broke through with westerns, films that demanded grit, silence, and integrity, all things that Scott delivered effortlessly. He became the kind of star whose name alone sold tickets. Audiences knew what they were getting with a Randolph Scott film, a man who stood for justice, who didn't flinch under pressure, and who always took the high road, even if it cost him. From The Last of the Mohicans to Western Union, and then on to classics like 7 Men from Now and Ride the High Country, Scott carved out a legacy as one of the most dependable and beloved stars of the genre. Over the span of 3 decades, he starred in over 60 westerns. That wasn't just a career, that was a cultural monument. Yet even within this heroic image, there were layers. There was something private in his eyes, as if part of him was always somewhere else, just out of reach. He never chased scandal. He never played into the gossip. But fans noticed his long-term bachelorhood, the elegant beach house he shared with Cary Grant, and the unusually close friendship that spanned years. The studio system, of course, spun it into a marketing campaign, 2 handsome bachelors living the high life. Magazines featured photo spreads of them sunbathing and playing golf. But even then, the questions were there. People talked, but never out loud. Because in those days, speaking the truth could end everything. Through all of it, Scott kept working. He knew how to keep the cameras focused on the story, not the man behind the mask. That discipline made him a professional's professional, and an enigma. He played men of honor and duty while navigating a world that offered neither to people like him. But he never slipped, never showed weakness. If anything, his performances became even more layered, even more poignant. Maybe that's why he connected so deeply with audiences. Somewhere they sensed the unspoken depth. As the Western faded from popularity, Scott walked away from the screen on his own terms. No scandal, no dramatic exit, just one last ride into the sunset with Ride the High Country, a film critics would later call his greatest. But behind that final bow was a man who had built a career on silence, both heroic and heartbreaking. And as time would reveal, his greatest role may not have been on screen, but in the life he lived just out of sight. As the curtain slowly lowered on Hollywood's golden age, Randolph Scott did something rare. He stepped away on his own terms. In 1962, after filming Ride the High Country, he quietly retired from acting. There was no dramatic farewell tour, no public goodbye. Just silence. The kind of silence that had always followed him. He left the spotlight not in scandal, but in dignity. At 64, he disappeared from movie sets and reappeared in a world that had never truly seen him for who he was. A man of few words, now embracing a life with even fewer eyes watching. In retirement, Scott lived in Beverly Hills with his wife, Patricia. To many, it seemed like the perfect ending, a gentleman cowboy settling down. But to those who looked a little closer, the story remained complicated. Friends noted his continued distance from public events. He rarely gave interviews. He declined honors and reunions. He preferred to stay quiet, to live in the shadows of his own legend. There was peace in that solitude, but perhaps also something unresolved. A part of him, still guarding something precious, still playing a role even off screen. Whispers about his past didn't vanish with retirement. If anything, they grew louder over time, especially about the decades-long friendship with Cary Grant, a relationship that had inspired rumors, speculation, and quiet admiration. Some called it a bachelor bond. Others said it was love in hiding. But neither man ever confirmed or denied it. They didn't have to. In a time when being gay could ruin everything, silence was the only armor they had. Scott wore his well, right up until the very end. On March 2nd, 1987, Randolph Scott passed away at the age of 89. The news barely made headlines. He died quietly, just as he had lived. No dramatic send-off, no emotional tributes, just a simple farewell. And yet, for those who remembered him, for those who saw through the Hollywood mask, it was the end of an era. Not just of Westerns, but of a generation of men who carried the unbearable weight of invisibility. Scott's passing wasn't just the end of a life, it was the quiet closing of a chapter never fully written. There were no tell-all memoirs, no interviews revealing secret truths. And maybe that was by design. Maybe Randolph Scott believed the silence was his shield, or maybe it was his gift. A final act of love for the people he cared about, people he could never name. His death left more questions than answers. But in those questions, we find something more valuable than certainty. We find courage. The courage to live, even in hiding. The courage to love, even in silence. And the courage to leave behind a story that still matters, long after the final scene. Years after his final bow, Randolph Scott's name still rides through the American imagination like a lone figure on horseback. For Western fans, he remains the gold standard, the upright lawman, the quiet avenger, the man who never missed his mark. His films continue to air on classic movie channels, his stoic image still framed on the walls of collectors, and his legacy continues to inspire directors who reimagine the cowboy myth. But Scott's influence extends beyond dusty trails and saloon doors. It lives in the quiet power of those who choose dignity over drama, strength over spectacle. Today, a new generation of actors lives with freedoms that men like Randolph Scott could only dream of. Love can be open, truth can be celebrated, and yet the cost paid by those before remains etched in history. Scott never made speeches about equality. He never raised a flag or marched in protest. But in his own silent way, he helped pave the road, simply by existing in a space where he wasn't supposed to, simply by surviving in a world that demanded erasure. His life is a reminder. Some revolutions begin not with a shout, but with a whisper. Filmmakers and historians now look back with deeper appreciation. Scott's performances are revisited not just for their cinematic craft, but for the complexity behind the characters. There's a vulnerability in his stillness, a longing in his quiet. Whether intentional or not, those layers resonate differently now. They speak to anyone who has ever had to hide part of themselves. They speak to those who've worn a mask just to be seen. And in that, Scott's story becomes more than Hollywood history. It becomes human history. Tributes to Randolph Scott often focus on his roles, his professionalism, his image as the gentleman cowboy. But there are quiet tributes too. Private reflections from actors, writers, and fans who see something familiar in his journey. Those who see the unspoken cost of living behind a curtain. In a way, that may be his truest legacy. Not the applause he received in life, but the understanding he inspires in death. Not the characters he played, but the man he never got to be in public. And so the legacy of Randolph Scott lives on, not just in film reels and fan posters, but in every artist who refuses to compromise their truth. In every person who lives quietly yet bravely, and in every story like this one that dares to speak the name of a man who lived with courage, even when the world offered him no stage for it. As the last frame fades and the screen turns dark, we're left with a feeling, one that's hard to name. It's not just nostalgia, it's reverence for a man who rode through our imaginations without ever needing to raise his voice. Randolph Scott wasn't the loudest star. He didn't chase fame or flash. And yet somehow he remains unforgettable, because some legacies don't scream, they linger. Like a lone rider on the horizon, quiet steady and impossible to ignore. He gave us stories of justice and honor, even as his own truth lived in the shadows. We say goodbye to Randolph Scott not with judgment, but with understanding. The world he lived in didn't allow him to speak freely, to love openly, or to live without fear. But within those constraints, he still stood tall, still gave us everything he could. And in that, there's something heroic. Maybe even more heroic than the roles he played. Because he didn't fight villains with fists, he fought silence with grace. He didn't get to tell his story, so we're telling it now. And in doing so, we honor not just him, but everyone who walked that lonely path. If you've ever felt like you had to hide who you are, if you've ever wondered what it would be like to be truly seen, then this story is yours too. That's what makes Scott's legacy so powerful. It's more than Hollywood. It's human. It reminds us that behind every perfect smile, there can be a silent battle, and behind every legend, a truth waiting to be heard. And sometimes honoring someone isn't about uncovering their secrets. It's about making space for the truths they couldn't say out loud. So let's take this moment not just to remember Randolph Scott, but to reflect, to think about the people who shaped our culture in silence, the ones who taught us courage without ever using the word. Let's keep their stories alive by telling them, by saying their names, by recognizing their invisible contributions. Because in the end, history isn't just what's written in books. It's what lives in the hearts of those who remember. Now we turn to you. What are your memories of Randolph Scott? What films touched you? What moments still linger in your heart? Share your thoughts in the comments. Let's create a space where we honor not just the actor, but the man. Because some goodbyes aren't really endings, they're invitations to see more clearly, to feel more deeply, and to remember that even in silence, a legacy can thunder across generations.